this last video of our series, I want to talk about what I'll call the big picture about the big picture. Here's what I mean. You'll often hear Dr. Michael Licona, the literary device theorist, talk about the gist of the story or the big picture, the essence of the story. And the idea is that if the gospel authors altered some things, it's really not important as long as they did not alter what these scholars believe to be the big picture or the essence of Jesus' message or something of that kind. What is the biggest big picture event in the Gospels that's recorded in the Gospels? What do we Christians, I think, agree is the biggest big picture event? And I think we would agree that it's the resurrection of Jesus. Now, the resurrection of Jesus is at the center of Dr. Licona's own ministry. His ministry is called Risen Jesus, and he debates skeptics defending the resurrection, and that's a great thing. But unfortunately, the compositional device theories tend to call into question the resurrection accounts that we find in the Gospels. We can see this back in his 2010 book, which was on the resurrection of Jesus, called A New Historiographical Approach. And here was what he said about the resurrection accounts in the Gospels. We have resisted the temptation to employ sources of uncertain value, as well as potential facts that would certainly bolster the resurrection hypothesis, RH. In our assessment of the relevant sources in terms of their ability to yield valuable data for our investigation, we noted that the resurrection narratives in the canonical Gospels may be useful. However, because of unknowns, such as the amount of liberty the evangelists may have taken in their reports, as well as the sharp disagreement among scholars pertaining to their reliability, we have chosen to use them only when necessary and to rely more heavily on earlier sources about which more is known, and a greater agreement exists within a heterogeneous majority of scholars. As we've seen, the compositional device theories, as applied to the resurrection narratives, are very consistent with this generalization, this analysis that we don't know how much liberty the evangelists might have felt free to take, and it's possible that they took quite a bit. Here again are just some facts that are recounted in the accounts that there are allegations of change. First of all, that Luke altered the time, place, and manner of Jesus' first appearance to his group of disciples, moving it from Galilee to Jerusalem, and thereby changing the circumstances rather importantly. This would even make it difficult to fit in the Doubting Thomas sequence. Second, that Luke altered the words of the angel at the tomb to remove a reference to a meeting in Galilee because he was going to move that meeting to Jerusalem and replace it with a different reference to Galilee, that Jesus foretold these things when he was in Galilee. Third, Matthew or John altering the circumstances quite radically in which Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. A fourth one that I haven't mentioned heretofore in this video series is the idea that in his first meeting with his disciples, John invented what I might call the sub-incident where Jesus breathes and he says, "Receive the Holy Ghost. And whoever sins you forgive, they are forgiven," and so forth. The idea is that that was John's replacement for Pentecost, that John was not going to narrate Pentecost, and he put this in instead. So, and that is something that Dr. Licona suggests quite strongly that John did in his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? Now, with all of these potential changes to the resurrection accounts on the table, I think we can fairly ask some questions. Let's consider those who originally claimed to be witnesses of the resurrection, the disciples, the women who went to the tomb, and so forth. Did those original alleged witnesses even claim that Jesus ate with them? That's recorded in a couple of the Gospels, but did that really happen? Did they even claim it? Did they even claim that Jesus met with them for long conversations, during which they were in groups and he was talking to them for a long period of time, repeatedly? That's pretty clear in the Gospels. Did they claim that they could touch him? Did they claim that he invited them to touch him? Did they claim that they met him in groups of different sizes, under different circumstances, indoors and outdoors, over a period of weeks? Was the skeptical Thomas then later convinced that Jesus was raised from the dead because he saw him? Was this something that they even claimed? Or is even the claim that they made these claims more than what historians can attest to, going beyond the historical data and so forth? My husband Tim and I wrote an article on the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. It was published in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology in 2009. In that article, we made a very strong case for the resurrection of Jesus, and what we took as sort of the basis, the facts to be explained, was the idea that the original alleged witnesses at least made these claims. And then we argued that it's very difficult to explain that on any hypothesis other than the literal physical resurrection of Jesus. But we made it clear then, and we've been consistent ever since, that the details of the claims are important. Particularly the physical details and the length of time and the fact that they were in groups, all these kinds of things are important to the strength of the case. This leads us to a pretty serious issue and what we might call a paradox. If we say that the gospel authors cared only about the big picture, we may put ourselves in a position where we can't even defend the big picture. God, as the saying goes, is in the details. This leads us to another point. When it comes to our lives as Christians and our work as Christian ministers, pastors, counselors, that kind of thing, do we need more than just a big, broad picture for our churches and for our lives as Christians? Now, I think it's obvious that we do. When you're a pastor, suppose you get up on a Sunday morning. Do you just preach? If you're preaching on the Gospels, an expository sermon, do you just preach on the biggest gist of the incident or also on the details of the incident? Well, I think you preach on both, obviously. So, for example, you might not just preach on the crucifixion generally, but also on the specifics. So, for example, that Jesus said, "I thirst, and it is finished," from the cross, and that he was really suffering in that way, and that's why he said, "I thirst." And you would draw out the implications that these have for theology and for who Jesus was and for his victory over death. Might you preach on the fact that the disciples were squabbling about who would be the greatest in the kingdom on the very night in which Jesus was betrayed? Of course you might, because there's a kind of irony to that on that very important night, they were fighting about such a trivial thing, and then Jesus washed their feet, and he rebuked them as well. Well, in Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, Dr. Licona suggests very strongly that Luke may well have moved that squabble from a different incident and put it into the context of the Last Supper. When you're comforting the bereaved, do you tell them that Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live"? Well, of course, I certainly hope you do. Okay. Well, Dr. Craig Evans has strongly suggested that the I am sayings with predicates such as "I am the resurrection and life" are historically dubious, that these might be creations of the community that created the Gospel of John. That would call into question what you're telling these bereaved people. I think we definitely should not be telling pastors that it doesn't matter. I think that would be condescending. A good shepherd wants to feed his flock on facts, on actual historical facts, and tell them the truth. When you're doing marital counseling, or maybe you're counseling someone who's already been divorced, do you tell him that Matthew, in his gospel, accurately records that Jesus said divorce is not permitted except for fornication? That's sometimes called the exception clause. That is recorded only in Matthew. Well, Evangelical New Testament scholars Robert Stein and Dan Wallace have theorized that Jesus never said that Matthew inserted that as something that he believed Jesus would say, or that he believed was consistent with Jesus' other teaching, but that historically Jesus didn't say that was Matthew's insertion. I think that could definitely make a practical difference to how much weight you placed on that exception clause if you thought that Jesus didn't really say it. When we meditate on the Gospels in our personal devotions, we often use aspects of the Gospels that are details of the narrative or of Jesus' teaching, specifics, what I might call specifics, and those are important. We apply those to our lives. We draw out implications of them. In his conclusion video, Dr. Licona mentioned some correspondence that he had with a reader who was helped by his work. I also receive unsolicited correspondence from readers who've been helped by my work, and one of these, a man named Charles Drennan of Memphis, gave me permission to talk a little bit about our correspondence. And he wrote to me to say that The Mirror or the Mask was helpful to him because of its robust defense of the historicity of Jesus' teaching. And he said how important he'd found the specifics of Jesus' teaching in his own personal spiritual life. Here's what he said. When I was in 6th grade, in Bible class, our teacher mentioned the unpardonable sin. I became terrified. Had I committed it? Could I commit it? Etc. The thought of the unforgivable sin haunted me for a long time. I'm not sure where I would be without the soul-comforting, anxiety-abolishing words of Jesus. John 6:44, no man can come to me except the Father which has sent me draw him. John 6:37, him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out. I'm sure all of us can recall similarly specific aspects of the Gospels and of the teaching of Jesus that have been very important to our personal spiritual lives. Yet I think we'd have to acknowledge that if we adopted the compositional device views, we'd have to put a question mark over a lot of those. And we'd have to be honest and say, I'm not sure that those historically really happened. It's good to remember that big picture, that essence of who Jesus was and his message, does not exist in a Platonic realm, separated from concrete reality. Instead, it's built up of the specifics of concrete facts. So, for example, we know that Jesus was human from general scriptural teaching, but we also know it, most importantly, from the specifics of the narrative. So, for example, he wept at the tomb of Lazarus. Well, that's a specific. It's recorded, in fact, only in John. We can say, well, if we didn't have this specific or that specific, we'd still have others. We'd still have a case that he was human. And that's true. It's a cumulative case. But at the same time, when you make a generalization about details versus the big picture, how many of these specifics then are called in question? So we know Jesus' humanity in part by his suffering cry on the cross, I thirst. Similarly, we know that he had victory over sin and over death and accomplished the work that he was set to accomplish by the Father by his cry from the cross, it is finished. As I mentioned in a previous video, the details of the Gospels are also important to the defense of the faith. Over the years, as Tim and I have been defending the reliability of the Gospels, we found numerous details that are confirmed in the Gospels, way too many to list possibly, but I will give a few of them here, just specific details that are confirmed. The grass was literally green at the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus literally asked Philip specifically, where can we buy bread so that these may eat? John the Baptist literally heard that voice from heaven, and that was why he said, as recorded in John, I saw and bore record that this is the Son of God, because the voice from heaven said that it was the Son of God. The temple had been being built for 46 years. When Jesus cleansed the temple early in his ministry, that's mentioned only in John, and it's a specific detail. When Joseph returned from the flight to Egypt with Mary and the baby Jesus, he was afraid to settle under the rule of Archelaus, the son of Herod the Great. That's confirmed by external evidence about what Archelaus had been doing right then and how he had slaughtered a bunch of people in Jerusalem. So that little detail of the infancy narrative is confirmed. And here's one I talked about on an earlier video for Emmanuel Fellowship. The name Simon was such a common name at the time and place that the events in the Gospels took place that if you named somebody Simon when you were telling a story, you had to have some other designation to say which Simon you were talking about. That's confirmed by name statistics. Those are small details and many, many more. In fact, these give us a picture, we might say a big picture, of evangelists who were concerned about more than the big picture. It would be entirely fair to ask the scholars who have adopted these views whether they're going to provide help to Christian counselors, pastors, laymen, to make sure that they're basing their counseling and their ministry and their personal devotions upon the parts of the Gospels that are really historical rather than the parts of the Gospels that are not historical, that were changed. In fact, a mutual friend of mine and Dr. Licona's, Tom Gilson, the editor of The Stream, has publicly asked this question. Are they going to provide help to pastors to make sure that when they preach, they're preaching on the real historical parts of the Gospels and not on the other parts? So far, such help has not been forthcoming. From my perspective, that's a good thing because it gives us time. It gives the church time to pause, to really absorb the magnitude of the shift that's being recommended here and to understand that, and then to ask whether that shift is justified. Now, I've argued at length and in detail that that shift is not justified. But I have not asked you just to take my word for it. I haven't just said, well, I'm Lydia McGrew, take my word for it. No, I've given specific arguments for it. I've also not asked anybody to reject these views out of hand because of a priori theological presuppositions. Instead, I've answered the arguments for this view and then provided arguments for a different view of the Gospels that I've dubbed the reportage model. Dr. Licona often articulates a principle, and as far as it goes, it's a good principle. He mentioned it again in his conclusion video, and here's approximately how that goes. Our view of the Scriptures should conform itself to what we find the Scriptures to be, to what we find in the Scriptures and the way that God has given them. We should not try to make the Scriptures conform to our preconceived ideas of what the Scriptures are. Well, who could disagree with that? And certainly not I. In fact, by that same token, any good scholar can agree that we want our views of a document to correspond to what we find the document to be. But by that same token, that principle, that maxim, doesn't tell us which view of the Scriptures is right. Whether the reliable historical reportage model is right, or whether the compositional device view is right. Because it just says we should make our views correspond to what we find. Well, what if what we find is that they appear to be reliable witness reportage or based at only very few removes on reliable witness reportage? Well, then we want our ideas to correspond and conform to that. In fact, that maxim doesn't even tell you which type of scholar is more likely to try to make the Gospels and the Bible and the Scriptures conform to preconceived ideas. I've argued that it's at least as likely that someone who adopts the compositional device views will make the Gospels correspond and conform to his preconceived ideas. But if you just hear that maxim, that principle, you might think that the compositional device scholars are objective. They're just taking the evidence as what it is. They're humble. They're just accepting the Scriptures the way God has given them to us, and that the person who takes what we might call a more conservative view and who rejects those views is the one who's trying to force the Scriptures into a box of his own making. But I've argued that that's by no means the case. From overly specific and unjustified views of the Gospels genre to what I've argued are very confused interpretations of Greek exercise books, from incorrect and overly wooden and rigid interpretations of the historian Plutarch to at least equally misguided refusals to put together gospel accounts in harmonizations that can give us a total picture of what happened. I've argued that the compositional device theories fail at every point along the line. And throughout all of those arguments, the Gospels themselves come shining through with the luster of real history upon them. Now, in Dr. Licona's series, we've heard a lot about the consensus of scholarship, the majority of scholars, what the majority of scholars think, and so forth. I would contest some of those generalizations, especially when they allegedly concern the majority of evangelical scholars, even those who are living today. But here's another point. When we consider the consensus of scholarship, we mustn't forget what G.K. Chesterton called the democracy of the dead. Just because some scholars happen to be alive at the same time that we are alive, it does not follow that they are the ones who are most likely to be right. If I could have a fantasy baseball team of defenders of the faith and biblical scholars, someone I would want on my team would be J.B. Lightfoot. Lightfoot was the Bishop of Durham. He was an English bishop in the 19th century. And here's what Lightfoot had to say about the Gospel of John. The fourth gospel is replete with historical and geographical details. It is interpenetrated with the Judaic spirit of the times. Its delineations of character are remarkably subtle. It is perfectly natural in the progress of the events. The allusions to incidents or localities or modes of thought are introduced in an artless and unconscious way, being closely interwoven with the texture of the narrative, while throughout the author has exercised a silence and a self-restraint about his assumed personality, which is without parallel in ancient forgeries. And yet, John's gospel is the one that comes in for the greatest amount of question on the basis of these theories. It's supposedly even less historical than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, though supposedly they also took historical liberties. We could also consider the words of the Johannine scholar Leon Morris, who only died in 2006. Here was something he said about the Gospel of John. It seems to me that John is a greater figure than has been reckoned with. He is so supremely master of the situation and the tradition that he is able to bring out his essential point without distorting the facts. Many recent critics have found it impossible to believe this. They have reasoned that he must have been ready to distort facts, for his concern was with the interpretation of the facts, not with historical accuracy. This a priori approach should be firmly rejected. John tells us that he is bearing witness, and his testimony should be taken with the utmost seriousness. And I could do no better than to conclude this video and this series with some further words of Leon Morris about God and history and the Gospels. This is of the essence of the matter as the New Testament writers understood the faith. It was bold, and for most of the ancient world, a novel doctrine that God had willed to reveal himself in history. In fact, so bold a conception is this that sometimes men still shrink from its implications. It is difficult to resist the conclusion that some scholars have feared to trust God to history. The world of history is such an uncertain world. It is safer to rescue God from the whole world of history. However, God has preferred to reveal himself in the historical, and it is there that we must find him. I'm Lydia McGrew. You can contact me by emailing me at lydiamcgrew@gmail.com. Just introduce yourself a little bit when you write. Tell me a little bit about yourself. And you can also follow my public content on Facebook. Look me up on Facebook. I'll be the one in the red dress. Thanks for watching.